Good evening, everyone. It's September 30, 2012. I'm Rene Ritchie, and tonight we're talking to MG Siegler of Paris Lemon and TechCrunch fame. We're talking about Apple, we're talking about Google, we're talking about Maps, and we're talking about mobile development. This is the iMore Show.
Oh, that's not even my day job. My day job now is a kind of early stage investor.
Yeah, you jumped the fence.
Yeah. So, but I try and keep the writing up when I can. It's increasingly sort of an issue, but not really an issue. It's time consuming, so I try and keep it up.
It's interesting. I used to work in product marketing for an enterprise software company, which is as deathly boring as it sounds, but I had to talk to press all the time, and now I am press, and you were press, and now you have to talk to press all the time.
Yes, it's the weirdest things are doing interviews every once in a while. I'll get pinged from someone to do an interview about my life now or one of the startups we're investing in, and it's a total flip of the equation. Sort of weird.
Has that changed the way that you look at things when you still write about them now?
A little bit. I mean, for sure on the startup side of things. Although now given my role, I try to step back from writing about startups too much, especially for TechCrunch. But overall, I mean, not really with the larger companies. You think about kind of the implications of like if you piss someone off in the M&A department of one of these larger companies, like will that harm a deal or something for a startup of yours? But I tried not to think about that kind of stuff too much. I think at the end of the day, everyone's pretty practical, and they're thinking about how this all plays out, and there's good things said, there's bad things said, and at the end of the day it all evens out. And I don't think anyone has vendettas against anyone else, because as long as what you're writing is as you really feel, I mean, a lot of these companies sort of appreciate, if not in the time, aggregate kind of opposing views on certain things.
And you're very upfront about it. I mean, everyone knows your agenda walking in. You haven't made any secrets about where you're working, what you're doing.
Right.
And I think that it does add credibility, because if you have lambasted people in the past, when you do like something or when you don't like something, there's a lot more credibility, I think, to the opinion.
Right. That we saw that come into play, I guess, a bit with the Nexus 7 review that I wrote, which I actually wrote on TechCrunch. But I'd been obviously pretty critical of Android in the past, and I like the device, so I wrote good things about it. And everyone, of course, is jumping over like, "Oh my God, he likes the device!" And it's such a big deal. And some people are looking at it that it's such a big deal that I'm going against what I'd said. All the previous times. But I think it's also the smart people were looking at it as it's a big deal because that it's actually legit, since I've been saying, pretty much the opposite view of it for that whole time. It's
almost like when the Nokia Lumia 900 shipped and people actually liked it, which was like a profound shift in the tech industry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, good products at the end of the day, even if someone's saying they don't like it for whatever reason, if they are actually good products, the consensus usually agrees with that. So
well, I think a lot of us were very honest from the beginning, and we said, because Google would say things like we're open and Apple's closed, and most of our responses were make a good phone. I don't care, make a good phone.
Right. They're basically playing up a marketing angle, and who cares really? I mean, yeah, there's benefits to being quote unquote open, just as there are benefits to being quote unquote closed. Google was trying to suggest that they're being open, and the subset of open that they actually are was much more beneficial than Apple's kind of walled garden approach. But I think we've seen, just as you might imagine, that there are benefits and negatives to each of those different sides.
Do you think it's a double-edged sword? I mean, especially for Google, it almost like their open is like the chocolatey flavor in the supermarket that has no chocolate in it. And then when they do things like they make the Verizon deal for network neutrality, or they have a device that you can't access the bootloader, or they allow them to put crapware on the phone, it just seems to magnify like the contrast in that statement.
Right, and that's why I think it was kind of a silly marketing ploy that they were using the open thing for. It was an easy shot to take, so that's why they're going after it. Saying in their view, open is good and closed is evil. And while they're not explicitly saying that, perhaps they're obviously that's what they mean to imply when they get up on stage at their events and kind of say these things. But it really left them open to getting attacked when they do things that aren't the pure definition of open, some things you just suggested. And so that was, it backfired. And I think anyone could have seen that it would have backfired, from the outset, except whoever it was at Google that decided, and maybe it wasn't the marketing team, maybe it was, just some executives just kind of deciding that this is how they're going to, attack Apple because it's the most obvious way to do it.
Eric Schmidt has quickly become the new Steve Ballmer to me. Like whenever he gets in public, it means there's a guaranteed 2-3 stories that are going to follow along. And his latest, and it's a good segue into Maps, was that Google was just completely shocked. They were shocked and awed by Apple's move away from their mapping solution, even though Apple started buying companies in 2009, and everyone and their webmaster was writing about it months before WWDC.
Right. I will say in their defense, I believe that he gave those comments some Asian press, if I'm remembering it correctly. And a lot of times those things do seem to get misinterpreted. So maybe he didn't say it in exactly that connotation. I think that's happened to him before. I forget what exactly it was, talking about killer tablets or something like that, like a year ago. But let's assume he said about that. And I think that he gets himself in a little bit of trouble with these situations, and with Maps in particular. I mean, it just looked like Google was extremely either naive or incompetent if they weren't thinking about that Apple could potentially leave them, especially given the acquisitions that you mentioned since 2000. What did Google think they were buying these companies for? To just kind of, they don't do really talent acquisitions in the traditional sense. So I mean, everyone could see that.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me how everyone is framing their message for the media these days. And I'll start on Google and shift over to Apple. But the vibe I always get from Google is that Apple makes me think that they think I have absolutely no taste. And that I'm not quite worthy of the stuff that they're delivering. That's the kind of vibe I get from them. Where Google often makes me think that they think that I'm a little dumb. Like they can tell me that they're open. They can tell me that they had no idea about Maps. They can tell me these things that they know that I know is not correct, but they still tell them to me.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to frame it, I think. Apple, if you don't agree with something that's in their messaging, it's you're the one who's kind of wrong about that. And Google, you're the one who's kind of dumb if you don't really understand what it is they're trying to go after. I think that's a pretty fair way to put it. I don't know exactly what Microsoft's spin on all this would be. They've changed so much. Like now we're seeing bombarded by those IE9 ads on TV now. Like I was just watching football today. Must have seen that IE9 commercial 20 times. And it's like they're overly trying to be hip now. They're playing a kind of catchy song, and it's this kind of showing that they want to be both beautiful and hip. And it's just like it's totally different from what they've been.
Well, there are three such fascinating companies, and the way that they think they have to make us perceive them, I think, is endlessly fascinating. And Microsoft, all three of them have this problem where they get focused to the degree that they lose peripheral vision, and they get fixated on something rather than just fixed on it. And I think we saw that with Microsoft and their death grip on this Windows thing. And now even the Microsoft logo is a Windows logo.
Right, which is strange because that opens them up to a huge potential problem down the road. I think that we all would agree that eventually Windows as we know it now, and we'll see whether or not this happens with Windows 8, but Windows as we know it now is not going to be the thing that everyone's using in 10 years. And so when they tie their entire message and identity around the 4-quadrant window, that's a little silly. What happens in and you could say that, well, Windows Phone is an extension of Windows, I guess, but I don't even know why they call Windows Phone Windows. Like there aren't a window. What are they doing? Why isn't it Tile Phone, or why isn't it
X Phone Halo Edition on the middle of the shelf?
Yeah, right. And so why isn't the video game system? Why isn't that Windows living room box?
Yeah.
Or so they have this weird mishmash. But that's always been the problem with Microsoft. They have these ridiculous branding ideas. Remember when Windows Phone, when Windows Phone first came out, Apple Windows Windows Mobile. It was Windows Phone 7
Series,
phone,
Windows Phone 7 series phone.
7 series phones, right? And like there were two. If you wanted to actually talk about a phone, you had to say phone twice in
Yes.
there. And they cleaned that up a bit, but
But it's still Windows Surface for Windows RT and Windows Surface for Windows Pro 8. It's still
right. Yeah, they did, and they cut down the number of flavors of Windows this time, right? But it's still, yeah, like you say, there's Windows 8, there's Windows 8 Pro, and then there's Windows RT and RT. Do you know what that stands for? Runtime? Is that correct?
There's two. There's WinRT, which is a runtime, and then there's Windows RT, which I think carries over the initials, but maybe not the meaning.
That's like, what on earth were they thinking calling it that? Why not just Windows Tablet or Windows? I don't know, something Windows Phone for tablets, something like simple at least. That's pretty ugly too. But something Windows RT. What like every consumer
Surface? Just call it Surface.
Yeah, right. And then the fact that Surface comes over from the other Surface, which is not. And now they have that other company that they bought that they're now doing the 80-inch screens or whatever. And
they have a Nook deal somewhere in their future that we still haven't seen realized.
Right.
So
yeah.
Well, there's this interesting thing about Apple to me is that Apple's one of the few companies that doesn't mistake their products for their business. Like they come out with iPods, they'll kill that iPod with the next one. They'll kill it with the iPhone. They'll kill their Mac business with the iPad because they know that those are just instances of what they do. And a lot of other companies seem to make that one product and then hold on to it until long after they've crashed and burned.
Yeah, and Microsoft is now the core example of that, as we were just talking about with not only Windows, but with Office. Yeah. Those are kind of two big things, and now servers are coming into play, but that's still a good business for them. But we'll see how that plays out with Google. What if Google search starts to decline over time? Obviously, that hasn't happened yet, and there's no signs of that happening. But you think, you extrapolate out 10 years, 20 years, will they be able to break away? It seems like they're working on just about everything under the sun.
Yeah.
So should be able to just let Google search go if it ever does go, or if it evolves into something else. But Microsoft hasn't been able to do that, and Apple absolutely does do that every single time.
Yeah, it's that cliche that you never see the company that's going to make you extinct coming. You're focused on your business. Like Microsoft protected Office, but didn't see Google Docs coming because the internet was this big amorphous thing. And I think Facebook is maybe trying to prevent that by buying things like Instagram as fast as they can. And I'm not sure if Twitter is going to do that, but.
And that's it looks like smart moves on their part. There's those reports out now that Instagram is seeing more daily active users than Twitter is already, and its growth has been insane since the Facebook deal went down. So it's just like, $1 billion is a lot of money to pay for a company that has no revenue, but if you can eliminate a potential major competitor down the road, then you do that, and you got to really take a risk to do that, but you also have to have foresight to do that. And I think that we'll look back on that as a very savvy move on their part.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think it echoes a lot of what's going on with Apple now. For example, they built iCloud. They no longer wanted to be beholden to another company for their services. They built their own Maps application, which is a whole other subject. But they decided to let social go. I mean, they're letting Ping go. They're outsourcing that, and they're abstracting it so they can just slot in Facebook and Twitter. So they're being much more careful about picking their battles now.
Yeah, and I think that that's the right strategy. I think that, it's interesting to think if Ping hadn't been the total failure that it was, would they then try to move more into the general social space and come up with their own Twitter or Facebook competitor? But on the flip side, I don't really think that that's true, because there were the reports, of course, at the time of Ping that Facebook was supposed to be a big part of Ping, and that just got killed in the last second, and so that kind of hurt the entire product to begin with. And who knows what it would have been like with Facebook? Maybe it still would have been a failure, or maybe it would have been successful. But I think that Apple looked at that as something that they're just not going to get into at this time, because really, what value would they derive from that? Does that help them sell more units? You could certainly argue that having Twitter and Facebook deeply integrated into the iOS layer, not only from a product perspective, because you can tweet and you can send Facebook status messages, and that's a nice feature to have, but I think it's a killer feature from the on the application layer, because you can easily one-click sign in to all these different apps now and open up that for developers to be able to share right from within iOS. So that makes a ton of sense for Apple to go that way.
And also, I think that, you look at OS 10, you look at Windows, these are platforms you measure in decades, and cloud services are going to be platforms you measure in decades. I mean, arguably, Google took over from the AltaVistas and the Yahoos and whatnot, but Facebook, from MySpace, from Friendster, I think these are semi-permanent now, but you seem to be more subject to the whims of social migration, and maybe they want to be agile and see what's next before they.
Yeah, yes, I would agree with that also. I think, it seems probably likely that when they were doing the Twitter deal last year, they probably wanted to do a Facebook deal at the same time, and maybe they would have rather done a Facebook deal. That's impossible to know for sure, but I think that they probably saw Facebook as the one that's cemented the most, because they do have, almost 1 billion users now, where Twitter has whatever they have, 250 million or 300 million or something like that. It's still a huge amount, but not a lot compared to Facebook. And so, yeah, you're probably right that they, they're just seeing how this shakes out, and how could they possibly compete even with the massive reach that they have with these iOS devices. They'd have to. And as we're seeing now with Maps, they'd have to create a really, really killer product to get people to use it, even though it's going to be pre-installed on every device if they did it in social. And now we're seeing the downside of if they don't have the truly killer product nailed with Maps, and they're shoving it in hundreds of millions of spaces.
Yeah, Maps is so interesting, and that Maps to me is this giant historical lesson. I mean, we saw Google. I was looking at the original review on Trionauts for Google Maps on the Trio 680 back in 2006. It's not that different. I mean, the Google had a solid mapping service back then, but they seemed to be petrified at a certain point in time that Microsoft, of all people, would block them from Windows Mobile, because that looked like the future of mobile, and they wanted to have a platform that they could, or maybe BlackBerry, because I keep forgetting that BlackBerry was around, but BlackBerry was definitely around then, would block them off, and they would lose access to mobile user bases, and so we begat Android, and that sort of begat the cycle of them becoming competitors rather than partners.
Yeah. I was reading Danny Sullivan. I just happened to be reading this yesterday. Danny Sullivan had written a good post a month ago, kind of talking about Google's evolution from a search engine to all the various things they're doing. And of course, a big portion of that now is Android. And he brought up a good point that, Google, part of the reason why they did Android was what you were talking about, to make sure that they could never be at the whim of either Microsoft or RIM, but also, of course, Apple down the road. But at the time, Google and Apple were as close could be. Eric Schmidt on board, etc. But it ended up being this weird situation where Google is directly competing with Apple because they feel like there's going to be, there's power that's not in their hands, and we're now seeing Apple stripping away that power by removing Maps, by removing YouTube and things like that. But they're only doing that because Google is directly competing with them.
It's like one of those Star Trek episodes where Picard's yelling, "It happens in the past, Will!" and they create their own paradox.
Exactly. But I mean, I do think it was inevitable for if a company is going for the real big time, and real big time meaning one of the pillars of, our age and technology, on the internet and with these devices. I mean, they're going to have to get competitive with one another eventually, because these are public companies. There are demands to keep revenue growing and keep the public investors happy. And in order to do that, you kind of have to expand into a lot of different markets or create new ones. Apple has done a good job at creating new opportunities without really encroaching too much on current players' grounds. Google has done the opposite, where they are encroaching on everyone else's ground, but that's also helped their revenue opportunities, though not to the extent of the hardware side of Apple yet. Most of Google's revenue is still, the vast majority is still from search advertising, but Android and stuff down the line should be able to produce good revenue for them.
There's these two analogies I keep coming back to. It's that we see these monsters fight like King Kong and Godzilla, and we kind of think we're the audience eating popcorn, and often we are the villagers screaming in terror underneath their feet. And it's not because they're trying to deliberately be mean, but it's just that any company sufficiently large is indistinguishable from evil because their interests start to diverge from our interests.
Yes, right, and as we both know, this is playing out directly now with the Maps situation and with Google and Apple in general. Like, you think back to the original iPhone 2007, you had Eric Schmidt on stage talking about search and talking about Maps and email and all that. how great would it be now if those two companies were working together on even the latest iteration of the iPhone? Apple could give Google design input to help make their iOS apps better and help make kind of their web pages more tailored specifically for the iPhone. And who knows, maybe they could have things in the background that are working in different ways than they did now. But that was a reality that was never meant to be. And you think about it also in the context. I think about it more in the context now of Google with Amazon, because those are now directly competitive, of course, in the tablet space in particular. And it seems almost like it would be almost perfect to combat Apple if the two of them, if Amazon and Google got together, because Google, has good software instincts and great web instincts. Amazon has great web instincts insofar as e-commerce and also content, which Google is not good at. And so they complement each other in a lot of ways, but just not meant to be.
No, I think we also forget that companies are people. They're driven by, usually people with pretty good egos because they got into the positions of where they are, and they have very clear visions of where they want to be. It would be nice if there was a fringe universe or a mirror universe where little goateed Eric Schmidt was still on the Apple board. But yeah, it seems like there's an incredible advantage that Apple had with having iTunes so early and having credit cards and being able to take cash in so many countries so quickly that Amazon and Google are still playing catch up with and aren't doing it together.
Yeah, and so that's a great point. Amazon has a great base of credit cards, but it's mainly for the U.S., right? Because their content overseas just isn't anywhere near what it is. Apple has a great content now overseas. It's still expanding, but I think that they're one of, everyone would consider them a major player now when it comes to both music content, of course, and also now increasingly movies and television shows. But yes, they have a huge, 400 million plus, maybe 500 million now, installed base of those credit cards, and that's something else that we're going to see now. If Apple does start to encroach on other areas, there's a lot of talk, of course, with Passbook.
Yeah.
Do they get more into the payment side of things? And that's something that established players do exist in. But Apple, of course, didn't include NFC in this. Do they do it another way? Do they do it through Bluetooth? Do they do it over Wi-Fi? Do they just do it over the internet? We'll see. But that's going to be something that may be too tempting for Apple not to get into, because they have those 400 to 500 million credit cards on file. Like, why not use them in real world situations?
And another advantage I think they have is that their business model isn't tied to being able to sell content the way Amazon's is. So they can go into 90 countries with the iPad and seed them. And when they get content there, people start buying it, where Amazon literally cannot afford to put the Kindle in any country they can't sell content into already.
Yep. It's just they have the exact opposite models. One's to sell the hardware, one's to sell the content. So yeah.
So if we scale back again to the Maps issue, Tim Cook put out a letter, a big mea culpa letter. We're sorry, we're working on it. And that brings two things to mind. And the first one is, to me, the letter itself was interesting, but that it got to the point where Tim Cook had to write that letter seems like a very strange occurrence of events had to get there. I mean, when Steve Jobs did the famous, everyone gets a bumper, the press conference. You want a bumper? Here's your bumper. You get a bumper. Everyone gets a bumper. And they got there again. And it seems like there's something inside Apple's culture that doesn't let them properly and preemptively handle crisis relations.
See, the way I view this Tim Cook's letter is almost the opposite of the AntennaGate press conference. So I was at the AntennaGate press conference, and I remember while everything was swirling around, things are getting out of control, and there's thousands of articles being written about the impending doom of Apple, etc. I felt like AntennaGate press conference was Apple's way of trying to show everyone that yes, this was a real problem. They'll admit to that, but they don't want to say they're sorry. And instead of saying they're sorry, they're just going to point out that everyone else has this exact same problem. Apple could have almost done something similar, I think, with this apology letter from Tim Cook. I think it would have been very ill-advised, but they could have said sort of like, well, when Google Maps started out, it wasn't that great, and here's some examples of it not being that great.
Could have had a web page with Nokia search results and Google search results.
Exactly. And they could have done that even now. There's of course places in the world where Google Maps still isn't great. It's not perfect. But I do think that that would have been ill-advised. I think that that would have caused a big backlash. I think that Jobs was able to get that across with minimal backlash. There still was backlash though after the Antenna Gate event itself, and I think Tim Cook's handling of it was, in terms of press interpretation, much wiser way to do things. And I think that there's a lot being said, of course, about, well, this wouldn't happen under Steve Jobs' watch, and everyone else. I think that that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Because obviously Jobs knew about the mapping project. He was instrumental to buying those companies early.
It started under Steve Jobs. I mean, if anyone is confused at all about the maps, it started under Steve Jobs.
And like he's never had a failure before. Of course, everyone's heard. There's been many of those. But I do think that that Jobs would have handled this apology situation differently than Cook did. I think that they're really starting to diverge here, and I don't think that that's a bad thing or a good thing. I think that it's just the way Tim Cook is versus the way Steve Jobs is. And so far, Cook's letter has been interpreted very positively in the amongst the people, at least, who were getting so worked up about the map situation. And I think he struck the right tone about it.
Yeah, I thought it was well handled. It was, given the situation as it stood the day he wrote that letter, it was probably the best way Apple could have handled the situation. But I still find it interesting that they got to that point, because iOS 6 Maps came out in beta back in June. People have been using it all over the world.
And you heard whispers about the exact problems that we're now seeing. And how were they oblivious to this? I don't know. I don't know if it's just like a matter of, kind of what I wrote earlier in the week, ripping off the Band-Aid and then just hoping that no one notices that it hurts kind of situation. That maybe they were just so much, they did not want to mention that it wasn't as good as a competitor's thing, because Apple never does that, except that they sort of did that, right? In the apology letter, they were forced to do that. They even had to mention their competitors who had alternative options that customers may want to explore. That the implied thing there is that it's better. But yeah, I don't know why they wouldn't do that. And they had the experience of putting things like Siri in beta. And so why not just put Maps in beta? And maybe it's because, just thinking out loud, Maps is so instrumental in a mobile device now. I mean, it's an absolute must-have feature. And so if you turn that from a core feature into a beta feature, or with a beta label, maybe they were afraid people would get even more up in arms, and they just felt like there's no way, even if they released it in beta, that they could still go with Google and have this beta app in the background, because the stuff Gruber and others have written about, where the timing of the deals just made that too tricky to try and navigate. Google would have really had Apple in a tough position.
I did an article, I think a week before WWDC, on setting expectations for Maps, and it wasn't completely Little Birdie free, but it was basically, I believe, what you could expect from Maps, and it ends up being exactly what happened with Maps. And my understanding is that, a lot of people thought that that's what would happen with Maps. So I wonder if there's some sort of risk assessment that was run and said, yes, we're going to piss off this amount of people, but this is our reality, given our Google deal, given where we are in the iOS release cycle. We have a lot of brand credibility. It's going to cost us this much brand credibility. We'll build it back in a year, and it's worth doing it now, even though it's going to cause turbulence and pain.
I think that that's probably right. I think that that's the way that they looked at it, and you got to make the call at some point to do it, and why not do it now? And we think that the benefits outweigh the risks of doing that, and they just miscalculated that, I think.
Yeah, and it's, like you said, you put out with beta, it does cover your ass, but it also creates a lack of certainty. And a lack of certainty in Maps goes back to when Apple initially disallowed turn by turn, because they said that, if someone drives into a lake, that's a big problem. You don't want anyone ever thinking that your maps are gonna, you're gonna end up in Cleveland when you're just trying to go to Queens. But it is a non-trivial effort to make maps. That story came out saying that 2 iOS engineers spent 3 weeks making the initial apps client.
Right. Yeah.
But that's because they had Google's data at the time. They just shoved it into a UI. But to make that data, I think, is hugely underestimate the problem. I think people underestimate how difficult a job that is.
Yeah, and Google, Apple right now, right, is I don't even know all the providers they're taking it from, but TomTom and they have Waze, they have several others, and they're kind of mashing stuff together, which is I guess in some ways causing the problem, because there's things that don't align perfectly, and places aren't quite where they need to be. But yeah, so you think maybe they felt, well, it worked the last time when we just shoved a bunch of data in from Google. We made the front end to it, just fly. So why not do it again with just a bunch of other providers and hope the same thing? The problem is that, Google has done a really good job over the past 7 years with their mapping product. And, they've Street View, and not just Street View, but the Street View cars, and they're collecting all this data that really no one's been able to access in any other way. Any of these other mapping services don't have the same level of data. Some of them are better at other things, I'm sure, but and all the Wi-Fi points of interest and all those kind of things that Google's just done a really good job, and they set the bar really high. And I guess Apple kind of misinterpreted how high it really was set.
Yeah, I think, Apple has almost limitless money. They have 100 and whatever billion in the bank, but they don't have any more time than anybody else. And Google spent so many years doing data cleansing to take all these, because if you look at raw map data, the same two addresses are in wildly different forms. Telephone numbers have all sorts of different characters interspersed in them. It makes my head hurt, the kind of data cleansing you would have to run on that to make one unified data set to present to users in an understandable form. And I think that's a testament to how good Google's data was back then. But it also makes it interesting to me that Apple could make a great Google Maps client in 3 weeks with 2 guys, and yet Google's targeting Christmas or the end of the year to make an iOS map client with all their resources.
Well, you've seen, their iOS apps suck.
Yes.
There's no other way to put it, really. The Google Plus one is okay. It's sort of got new UI elements that aren't really in other iOS apps, so it's interesting at least, and it performs pretty well. Google Voice iOS app is awful.
Yeah.
The Gmail iOS app is awful. I'm trying to think of what other ones. The search one is fine. It's kind of silly, I think.
Their UI web views in a thin app client.
Right, and so I hope if they're taking this much time to do it, they're really going to do it right, because that's this thing flips back on its head now. If Google is going to release an iOS native Maps app that's going to compete now with Apple's own Maps app, they really have to make it good from a UI perspective and from a performance perspective, or else everyone's going to start complaining about that. And that's going to be a black eye on Google, but it will also, unfortunately, be a black eye on Apple, because everyone will say, like, well, you're really the cause of this, because who cares if Google can't make a good iOS app? They shouldn't have had to, because you already had all their data and you should have just kept this one. So I imagine, like, if they don't really nail this iOS app, make a kind of crappy app again, this is going to be a whole nother nightmare come the holidays or whenever they release it.
That was so interesting to me, is for the last couple of years, independent developers have literally coded circles around Google and Facebook, especially, to an embarrassing degree. And they're smart enough, like Facebook was smart enough to buy Instagram, Google's smart enough to buy Sparrow. I'm not sure why it was so hard for them to make mobile apps. Maybe it's just it was a blind spot for theirs. But hopefully with these new acquisitions, we'll start getting a Sparrow quality Gmail app.
I hope so too. I do think that part of it was, we know, of course, now, no less than Zuckerberg has said that they, underestimated or overestimated the power of HTML5 and underestimated the native app experience. And so the problem is that, working day to day in this environment out here, it's really hard to find top tier mobile developers, because it's hard to find them at startups, but it's got to be even harder to hire them into big companies, because if someone's a top tier mobile developer, they either want to do their own app or they want to work for a company that they, are early on at in a startup and, are really a part of that company. I can't imagine that a lot of them want to go work for Google or Apple, for that matter, or Facebook or any of the other ones. And so that's why, they do have to acquire them to kind of get them in there. And I think you're right now with some of the deals that have gone down, some of these companies have been able to acquire them. And so hopefully we start to see the fruits of that.
Yeah, and Apple hasn't kept the Siri people there. I think they're mostly, at least people who started Siri, they're mostly gone at this point. Google wasn't great at keeping anyone from Slide happy or keeping any apps from Slide going. So it's a huge cultural problem for them.
We see this exactly with Twitter now, right?
Yeah.
So they acquired Tweety. They had Lauren Bridger working there, and he's the guy who built Twitter for Mac and was building their iOS app. And then he left whenever he left, almost a year ago now, and now their apps are totally different, and everyone's just complaining about them because, again, they had one of the best iOS developers out there, and then they lost him, and he's the only one really who knew how to kind of maintain that code in the same way. Facebook had it years ago when Joe Hewitt built that app, and then he left, and then they had no one really to take it over. So it's a really big problem for these large companies.
Yeah, it's amazing how a single developer can be so key to an application, even in a company worth billions and billions of dollars.
It really is. It seems different for whatever reason than the web itself. Maybe it's because coding on the web is easier. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to start a flame war here, but um, it may be something as simple as that. There's many more people with those skills, and there's many more people who are very good at doing that. And because mobile, especially doing Cocoa programming and that kind of stuff, is still pretty nascent, and so we don't have a wide base of people who are excellent at it yet. But yeah, hard to know.
Well, still, I mean, you can count the amount of truly amazing Android. Like if you talk to a really good Android developer, or someone like Sebastian DeWitt who goes out and checks every screen technology to make sure the app looks right and develops anti-aliasing for pentile displays, these are not your normal guys.
Right.
And I wonder also, I mean, like Palm, when Palm made WebOS, they, in my opinion, they coded circles around Google that year. If you look at what Google did with Android, in the same amount of time, what Palm, tiny, underfunded, struggling Palm managed to do with WebOS, again, it wasn't even close.
Yep, and maybe that's somewhat related to the fact that WebOS is based on HTML, and there were a lot of people who were excellent at it at that point. I know it's different, slightly different, of course, but maybe it is something as simple as that. For whatever reason, most Android apps are, of course, built with Java, and obviously people have been doing that for a long time. But I think we'll hopefully get to parity with kind of people being really good at doing web development versus doing native mobile app development. But there's still some people, even now, even after Facebook admitted their mistake, that are just gung ho about trying to do HTML based mobile apps because it's so much easier for iteration. It's just easier if you're going to do cross device kind of programming. And so there's even people now trying to do it, and that keeps this dream alive and hurts the people who want great native apps.
Yeah, I think, again, they mistake the technology for the experience, and it's just you have to deliver that experience. If you can't do an HTML5, you have to recognize that. But I wonder also if it's almost like sports. I mean, you have your professional athletes, then you have your Michael Jordans and your Wayne Gretzkys, who are to a professional athlete what a professional athlete is to like a college or just a good hobby player.
Yep. Yeah. So are there going to be those really top tier people like always that just keeps on happening, and there will always just be a handful of people who are so much better than everyone else at doing this, and that may be the case. I hope not, because I hope that in an ideal world, I think we'd all want every single app to be up to the same level of quality and really good, whether it's from Google or it's from some small developer or it's from Apple.
So. I mean, we talked a lot about where, almost like this alternate reality, where Apple would be if Google hadn't been their adversary. If we fast forward a year, so we have the maps is causing a lot of consternation now. Do you think that will smooth over in the immediate future, or do you think this is going to be a long, hard battle for Apple?
I think it depends on how quickly they push updates out. Conceivably, they can do it most of it on the back end right now, and so. As long as and I don't know what they're doing, behind the scenes, it sounds like, there's been reports that they're hiring ex-Google Apps engineers to try and help on that end. But as long as they can push the updates pretty quickly, I do think that this will blow over relatively quickly. I mean, I look at my experience right now with Apple Maps. So I really haven't used it outside of San Francisco. I used it slightly outside of San Francisco, but here it's, I'm not trying to fanboy it up here, but I really do think that it's a pretty good experience overall. I haven't been able to not find anything that I've been looking for, and there's no question that the maps are more responsive than they were in the old version with Google, with the vector-based stuff now, and they just perform really well. The flyover stuff is nice, but I think that's kind of silly, to be honest.
It's good for Superman, but not for anyone who's at street level.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, he can tell exactly where he's going.
Yes.
And so I think, it's pretty good in San Francisco. If they can get it up to that level in other major cities, we'll start to see it die down. I'm getting ready to go on some trips to Europe, so I'm really interested to see just how bad it is. I've seen all the reports, of course, about places that are just completely without coverage, and so I'm really fascinated to see how it will actually play out when I'm trying to use it for something as vital as getting around while I'm traveling. my guess would be that this blows over relatively quickly, especially if we get the Google Maps app out in the next like 2 months, and then people have that as an alternative, and that kind of takes the pressure
Yeah.
off of Apple to get stuff out as quickly as possible.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting to see how long Google waits. And there was this rumor that Apple had the Maps app and wasn't approving it, and that turned out not to be a story. But it's interesting that we have to deal with these kinds of politics. Like, is Google going to wait as long as they can to make Apple suffer? Is Apple going to hold it and not approve it for as long as they can to kind of keep it off the play? They're not dealing with users; they're dealing with politics.
I think that if Google does delay to try and get people to switch to Android or whatever, I think that that's foolish. I think that at the end of the day, Google's model is to get as much information as possible. And what better way to do that than to have half of the U.S. market, which, the iPhone just about has. And it's not just the iPhone, by the way. It's, the iPads and touches. And so, of course, they want their application out there collecting this data, which helps their own services. And by the way, they can then advertise, which they were doing, which no one really talks about, but they were advertising on the previous version of Maps on iOS. They didn't do it a lot, but they had sponsored venues, and so they can continue doing that now in their own native application. And so I think that if they do that, we're going to see just how powerful the Android team is within Google. Whether or not they get this Maps application out there for iOS quickly or not, because the Android team probably not too incentivized to help out in any way with that. But Google itself should want this as quickly as possible on iOS.
Yeah, I mean, we have these. Apple's kind of immune to this because they only do their own stuff. But we saw Microsoft, like, do we give ActiveSync to our competitors, or do we keep it as an advantage for Windows Mobile? RIM, do we license the knock, or do we license BBM, or do we keep it as an advantage for our platform? And that's never something that ever has to cross Apple's mind. iTunes, maybe they'll give you iTunes, but.
And that brings up the notion of whatever happened to them open sourcing FaceTime. Or,
yes. Well, yeah, FaceTime is based on open standards, but in and of itself, the collection of them are not are not released yet.
They said right at one point that they were to put it out there for anyone to use, and that just kind of, I don't know what happened to that, but yeah, that's just really not in their DNA to do that. So maybe they're just quietly not doing that and hoping that no one realizes.
I mean, they do. I mean, they do large things like WebKit, but on other things, they're. It's just interesting how that is playing out. I think that shows a big difference in their market too, because Google absolutely wants that data. And in some ways now we get to see the real differences in the model. Like, we see the YouTube app now is a YouTube app that Google wants to make. And we're going to have the Apple Maps, which doesn't really care about our location data in terms of reselling it. And we'll have Google's Maps, which might include the latitude stuff and the advertising stuff that Apple was not keen on them putting into iOS Maps.
Yeah, I think, kind of an extension of that idea of Apple giving out some of their technology for other things to use. Like you brought up that they had to do that eventually with iTunes, and Steve Jobs, is famously known to have been against that, but it ended up being the right call. It expanded the market greatly for them at the time. I wonder if something like, Apple ID becomes a thing that they end up having to open up a bit. So like if they start using it for not only things like payments, but if they start using it for signups for games as kind of a games and applications and things like that, what happens if someone signs up for that with their Apple ID and then tries to the app tries to go cross-platform, whether it's not even to Android, but it's like to just a web app or something like that. Like they have to make Apple ID a standard ID that can be used for other things. I don't know.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because Apple's always been sort of even when they're not, they're always perceived as a quasi underdog who's making small technology sets for small people. But when they start getting majority share in markets and it starts becoming a legal lock-in, it's going to be interesting to see how they respond.
Yeah, and speaking of that's one of the most fascinating things I think about the Apple story right now is that they have complete dominance over the money side of things, right? So much more profit than everyone else. Samsung is making a lot on the Android side of things, but it's still, in terms of the smartphone share of those profits, it's still so largely favored for Apple. And so they've been able to build up a monopoly in the profit side of it. Don't have one in the actual usage. And that's like people talk about, and the flame wars get into the idea that, well, Android is winning this battle and they're taking over the thing. But it's like, that's really one of the greatest things that's happened to Apple in all of this, because they cannot be put under the same amount of scrutiny that they would be if they had that kind of level of market share. They would be. Who knows what would happen right now? There's no way that they could stop Google from launching certain things or making certain things the default on the iPhone and other companies for that matter. And they're just pretty much protected from that now because the market share is staying, at around what it's been at. And there is a second player that's really canceling it out.
They get the money without the scrutiny.
Yeah. It's
which is a pretty great position to be in if you're Apple. It's not so great if you're the inverse of that relationship where you get the scrutiny and none of the money.
Right.
Which is kind of like, Amazon's model of selling things just above break even. They're not losing money, but they're not making money. And there was that rumor of that $99 Nexus 7, which would, at that point, you might as well give people $100 for taking your tablet. It's kind of hard to build a business with that model.
Right. And that's been, that's how Amazon does things. And we're seeing, they're warning every quarter now that their profits might dip into the negative territory, and they're very close to it. They're making tens of billions of dollars in revenue, but they're making like $100 million or $50 million in profit. That could dip negative even this quarter. Because of the kind of the risks they're taking to expand into these new markets and stuff. And the thought there is, though, that they're doing this, of course, to be able to just plant their feet in the ground, and then they can start turning the wheels, turning the cranks, and just bringing in that money because they have the dominant position. But I think that's risky for them because then they open themselves also up to the government scrutiny stuff.
It's interesting, and you've mentioned this several times on Twitter. There's a Sean Blanc saying where that the iPad is the new laptop and the laptop is the new desktop. And I know when you travel, you have the iPad and the keyboard now. It's become like a primary device for you.
Yeah. And so I use the Logitech thin keyboard. There's two of them. There's one that's solar powered. I haven't tried that yet. It seems a little bit more clunky. I'm fairly happy with the regular one, which I haven't had to recharge yet. I think it's supposed to last for like 6 months.
Yeah, it's great. I haven't charged it either yet.
Amazing. And so I was just talking about I'm getting ready to go to Europe for a little bit longer than I usually do, than I've traveled recently, a few weeks. And so I'm debating whether or not to bring a laptop, because that would be a long amount of time to go without one, just in case something comes up and I have to do something quickly, because that's kind of the key thing now. I can do pretty much everything, and in the last like 4 or 5 trips I've gone on, just taken the iPad and haven't taken a laptop, and it's been no big deal. And I do email just fine, I write posts just fine. But I do think if there's some sort of crisis that comes up, like will I be able to, hop on my computer? I won't have my computer. Will I be able to hop on the iPad and just kind of manage everything as quickly as possible? I don't think that will come up, but it's still something that I have to learn to kind of let go of, I guess, in that situation.
For me, it's still OpenVPN. If I go for any length of time, I'm going to have something that can do OpenVPN. Otherwise, I'm going to be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, definitely.
It's interesting to me that with the rumors of Apple getting into the iPad mini market or the smaller, cheaper market, because you still have the iPad, the price of entry is $500, it's 9.7 inches, and it's a little bit heavy. And whether it's the price or the size and heaviness, some people just won't buy it. But if you scale all that down to $200, $250, super light, super small, you drop 2 major barriers of entry from Apple's mobile products.
Yeah, you're the guy, behind all the great source of info for these kind of things. We haven't heard much about the potential of this October event, right? What do you think's going on there?
I think it was so confusing to me, at least. The previous event, like I kept hearing iPad Mini was going to be in September. Like originally, I heard it was going to be October. That was back in May. And then as it got earlier, it heard like Apple was just going to do everything. They were going to rev the entire product line in September. And then and originally, I think the iPods were scheduled for October, and maybe that's why they're not shipping yet. And then the iPods got moved to September. Before we get to the iPad Mini specifically, it sounds to me like originally maybe Steve Jobs was a very early yes man. Like he would say, okay, we're doing this in September, this in October, and that would be it. And it sounds to me like maybe more opinions are being listened to or debated, or the decision-making cycle is longer, if not any less clear.
Yeah, I think that's right. I haven't heard much in terms of all this stuff, but I had heard a little bit that up until a little bit before the last events, they were kind of debating whether or not to do which combination of devices they were going to do at that actual event. And of course, it ended up being the iPhone as the marquee thing, and then the iPods as the other thing. I thought that was sort of weird too, because it almost seems like it should have been reversed, right?
Yeah.
Where it's the iPods. If you're going to do those, you do those first, leading up to the big reveal, which is the iPhone 5.
But you can't show the wide screen on the iPod Touch before you show on the iPhone.
Right, yeah, that's why they probably weren't able to do that. But you could have saved the iPod Touch to show at the same time as the iPhone.
That could have been the one more thing, a new iPod Touch.
Right. Yeah, I thought it was a little anticlimactic to do the iPods after the iPhone 5. But like we were talking about, I think that they were still deciding fairly recently which combination of things to do, and maybe it has something to do with the iPad Mini or whatever you want to call it not being quite ready to go. I don't know, but it's also interesting that it seems like the iPods also would have been a much better fit for October, because that's when iTunes is actually coming out. I mean, the weird thing where they showed off the new iTunes, but it's not available till October.
Yeah, the iPods and iTunes were not available until a month after the event, and they could have done that event.
Right. So why did they do that? And maybe, I don't know. Maybe that means there is no October event, or maybe it means that they had something that came up at sort of the last minute, and they were going to do iPad Mini, but then they had to push that, and so they kind of reconfigured everything. I don't know.
I know. I have this picture of like Steve Jobs would just have a gut feeling and say, okay, we're doing this now and this then. And Tim Cook is the operations guy, the logistics guy, and he's weighing all these numbers swirling around his head like a movie. And then he sees which ones light up. And it's like, okay, iPods, iPhone in September, Macs, iPad Mini in October. And it's a longer process.
Right.
Which is why we get the conflicted rumors.
Or maybe it's just as simple as, again, if there is going to be something in October, maybe it is as simple as the fact that Apple's two big categories now are the iPhone and the iPad. So why not split it up, do one with the iPhone, because that's ready to go in September, and that's the big one, and you need to get that out. And then just save the other one for October, where it's another kind of marquee event, because everyone will be waiting for this iPad update.
But this event was so strange for me, because everything I thought that they might save, like I thought they might save iTunes to show off with the new iPad, because if the iPad Mini is really just a small iPad, that's not a very long demo. This doesn't fill a lot of time. So what is that extra? And even the Macs, they've already shown a Retina Mac. So the biggest surprise is something they already did at WWDC.
Yep, I'm totally with you. That is the strangest thing to me about that event, the iTunes thing, because they did release iTunes 10.7, right? So they had a slightly new version of iTunes to unveil, or they could have just said you'll just not even talk about it. You just need it. They more than enough to talk about at that event, obviously. But they could have saved the new iTunes for October, and why they not do that? That's the big question.
And a lot of the things that we heard rumored about iOS 6 that didn't come out, I mean, there's two schools of thought. One is that they just ran out of time because they had to do maps, they had to do the Siri extensions, and they didn't have time to do anything else in iOS 6. Another school of thought is maybe there'll be some new iOS 6.1 things, because traditionally there was a 6.1 with the new iPods, and they didn't get that. So maybe the iPad Mini, whenever that's released, will have, Wi-Fi Direct or some sort of nice demo they can show off, because that didn't get shown off already.
Yeah, that seems like it could be the case. But yeah, I mean, we're it's October tomorrow, and it's heard anything, and they probably want to do it in the first part of October, I would imagine, to just have enough lead time before holiday shopping season. Though the rivals are tripping over themselves. No, the Lumia won't be out until November. The Amazon stuff is just starting to come out now. I think their new Kindles are shipping next week, and then the other shipping a little bit later. So yeah.
I also felt that when we first started hearing about the iPad Mini, it sounded like Apple thought that the Nexus 7 and the Kindle Fire had more legs than they ended up having, that there'd be a lot of pressure at the $200 price point, and that those tablets would really take off. And then we didn't see that.
I haven't really seen anything, and maybe you have, in terms of numbers for the actual sales figures for the Nexus 7. I mean, I was just coming to, they're advertising that thing like crazy. It's all over ESPN.
Front page of Google.com.
Yeah, right. The front page of Google.com. Never mind that. So I can't believe that it's not selling well, but you haven't heard anyone touting any numbers yet. Like, we didn't get first weekend numbers, and so that seems kind of strange. I assume that we're eventually going to see something, but maybe they're just not great. I mean, they have to be pretty good, but I don't know.
Yeah, and to me, when I looked at the Nexus 7 as well, and to me, there was all these rumors that the iPad Mini would be a small iPod Touch, and I kept hearing, no, absolutely not. This is a small iPad, and you'll understand the difference that means because the software is totally different. Where the Nexus 7 was like a big iPod Touch to me with a lot of Google smartphone apps just running larger.
Yep, yep, that's exactly right. And yeah, there's of course a school of thought too that maybe Apple was because there was both a Wall Street Journal and New York Times report after you had already talked about things stating that a smaller iPad was coming at some point this year. It's perfectly possible that Apple let that slip out around the time of the Nexus 7 unveiling just to dampen the initial sales of it.
And Apple is an incredibly agile company. We've heard the stories about Steve Jobs having the screen changed, right before the launch from plastic to glass. They've pulled cameras from iPod Touches right before launch. So if they had everything ready to go, if they didn't know what they were going to do in September and they could have gone in different directions, it's perfectly possible that they just have this stuff ready to go. And we're not hearing a lot about it now because all the busy work was done and they'll do the same launch work that they would have, but there's no more sort of internal fretting about what's happening and when.
And I think have they even released the adapters yet for the 30-pin connector to the Lightning one?
I've seen a few in the wild, but I have not. They're nowhere near me yet.
So that's another thing. Like they want presumably the iPad Mini would have the new Lightning connector. They need more of those out there. I mean, I just had to go to the store to buy additional chargers because I have all my other ones, but I don't have the adapters, and those weren't in the store yet. So. And I think you talked a little bit about this too, but the presumption is also that if they do the iPad Mini, they might do a slightly reworked version of the actual iPad itself to a new dock connector, right?
Yeah, and then it might have a little bit improved internal, so it wouldn't be as hot and it wouldn't be as maybe the new LTE chip. I'm not sure how far they'd push it.
Yep. Yeah. So,
but I mean, you heard that previous years. I think Gruber, you, and we also heard that there was the iPads have been ready to go before Christmas several years, and they've waited.
Yeah, that was what was it? I guess it was 2 years ago, right? It was before even the iPad 2 came out, and I was told that there was going to be a huge surprise in time for the holidays, and nothing 100% set in stone, of course, because it's so many months to go. This was like February or something like that. But that there would be another iPad that would be ready to go around that time. And presumably that was the Retina iPad. But that didn't end up happening. And it happened a few months later, but it didn't happen within the time span that they did it. So,
and I don't know if this is the same thing. Like they have this iPad 3 with the new stuff ready to go, and will they pull the trigger or not?
Right. I mean, it seems like if they do that, they'll have such big. This could be the biggest selling device in terms of first device sales that they've done. If they can get up to a good quantity of it, because if it's a price point that's around $250 or something like that, and it's holiday time and everyone's looking for something to buy, that could be just a massive, massive seller. But then what do? They run the risk a little bit of putting all their eggs in one basket, two baskets, right? It's like they have the iPhone is such a big part of the revenue now, 50% roughly. iPad is getting up to 20% or 25%. Something like that. And so with those two things being released so close to one another, that runs a risk, because then we'll have all the analysts who just totally miss on all of Apple's quarters because they don't understand that there's just going to be now this massive Q1, and then there's going to be dwindling sales throughout the rest of the year that are probably not going to hit projections based on previous years because everything is different. What does Apple do if they do an iPad Mini and a refreshed iPad in October? What do they do in their traditional February/March time? Do they do another new iPad? What happens to all those people who bought this newly refreshed regular iPad just a few months earlier? Do they push it to do that in May or something like that?
My understanding, and it may not be right, is that the iPad 3 refresh would be no big deal. It'd be, oh, by the way, we also have the new Lightning connector in the iPad 3, because they don't want to piss off anybody who bought it in March. And then you'd still have the iPad 4, or whatever they call it, in next year, which is the thinned down, no longer chunkier version of the iPad 3.
Well, there still would be people who are upset about buying one in the holiday time when it's like a brand new, even though it's not all that new, slightly new internals or whatnot, and a new dock connector. It's not too new, but still, it's a brand new device that they just bought that was just released, and they would, some people would be annoyed that they did that right before. I think, that won't stop Apple, of course, but these are things that they have to think about now.
That's the Apple that I think is so interesting now, because it sounds like there's this contingent at Apple that just wants to do the entire mobile update, end of the year, shock and awe, have it all done, everything lightning, everything updated, kind of show the amount of force they can project if they want to. And there's this other part of them that wants to know, we've got this fall and spring schedule now. We want to keep to the fall and spring schedule. It's got us this far.
Right. Yeah. And I think,
it's like skeuomorphic versus no skeuomorphic. They've drawn up sides.
A lot of religious battles going on internally. I think that they proved it this past year by switching things up, to the detriment of their stock price for a little bit. It ended up being good in the long run, but they're willing to do it. And so, I don't know. It just makes the rest of the year for all of us kind of a weird thing, because everything then is just right at the end of the year, and then you're just kind of waiting. And it seems like the only thing bad about that is that it I guess gives their rivals a little bit of extra oomph, because there's just nothing to talk about for 9 months of the year while everyone's just in this holding pattern waiting for the end of the year when the new Apple is going to come out.
Well, it's interesting because a couple of years ago at CES, there would always be a new Nexus right before CES, so all the geeks could have it. And because there hadn't been a new iPhone in 6 months, everyone wanted something new, and they got a lot of attention. Now the iPhones are in September, and there's all these crazy, are we going to get 6 new Nexuses? No new Nexuses, nothing, one. It's like Google can't counter program anymore because Apple's doing all these crazy Ivans.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, and that just goes to show you how much all these companies are watching Apple, and kind of we see, of course, whenever anyone knows that Apple's about to announce something, we get the rush of every other tech company trying to do something right before.
Yes.
It doesn't make it ended up not working out well for most of them.
Yeah.
Amazon had a good event, but the rest of them were kind of jokes and just looked silly and rushed. And
you have something, but no details. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, right. Thank you for coming. We don't have price. We don't have launch date. But we'll get back to you on that. And even Google with the Maps thing, right before iOS. The iOS 6 stuff at WWDC, Apple rushed to get a Maps thing out there because they were clearly terrified of what was coming, even though they didn't know that they didn't really have to worry all that much. And so it was a sign of weakness for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing for me, is because the rumors I heard back before the Maps thing wasn't really map-centric, is that almost like in the movies, there was this general or president who looked up and said, clear my skies. They just wanted Google off the platform. But at the same time, Apple has to fill all these things now. And you look at Siri and you look at Maps, and they're struggling a little bit. Like Google is doing interesting things with Now. It's doing all the predictive stuff that Palm talked about a long time ago, but never did. It knows when your appointments are, it knows where you are, it knows what traffic is. And Apple's still struggling with their internet services. Do you think this year they'll catch up with that? They'll pull some of that slack back?
I don't know. I mean, they still have a ways to go, it feels like. And I don't know if that's because when they fired whoever it was that was in charge of Mobile Me and put Eddie Q in charge, maybe it was spread too thin, maybe Forstall's spread too thin, maybe they need someone else new in there to kind of really do this stuff right. I don't know. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that in a timely manner. It seems like iCloud stuff is getting significantly better over time. They've got messages mostly figured out now. I'm not getting random ones, and I'm not getting some coming to some device and some coming.
And they're unified now.
And they're unified, right? So it feels like they're getting there on that end. But every new thing that they try to do, they seem to have some kind of stumble with in that category. So I don't know if it's a matter of getting a new leadership in there who can be fully dedicated to that. Getting a new SVP just for that stuff, or what the deal is going to be.
Well, Mansfield's got an empty title; they can slap whatever they want on there.
Nothing, so maybe he can be the SVP of internet transition hardware to internet.
Yeah, I wonder if their presentation style will change too, because Scott Forstall's gotten some flack for being so positive and showing such flawless demos for Siri and for Maps, and then not living up to expectations, or having the Samuel Jackson or Zoe Deschanel being so perfect and the technology living up to it. So I wonder if they've been chastened at all by this, and we'll see less bravura in their future demos.
It's a good question, but I feel like that would be a mistake for Apple to move away from that, because you want to aspire to be to have the greatest services, and obviously they shouldn't be lying about it, but they clearly think that I don't think that they would have said that they thought Maps was so perfect if they really didn't think that it was in many ways better than Google Maps. I think they just miscalculated the ways that it's not better in any way, which is the key way, which is data.
Yeah.
In terms of performance and in terms of beauty, it's certainly, I think you could make a good argument that it is better, but those things matter so much less than the data, where they just made a bad miscalculation with that.
No, yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, because there's that famous James Cameron saying where he says, "I want to try so hard that my failures are higher than most people's successes," and I think that's probably exemplified by Apple more than any other company still.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
All right, so MG, I really thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your time. Where can people find out more about you?
You can just follow me on Twitter at ParisLemon, and I'm parislemon.com or TechCrunch under my column. But yep, that's where I am.
You can find me at Rene Ritchie. You can find all of us at iMore. You can email us at podcast@imore.com, or just leave a comment on the show when it goes live. For all of our shows, go to mobilenations.com/shows. And if you haven't already, please subscribe in iTunes. Please leave a rating. It helps iTunes feature us, which helps more great people like you find us. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.